On the morning Lady Cecilia Ashworth dismissed 14 servants, she felt very powerful. She stood in the great hall of Thornfield Manor, her new silk gloves still smelling of the shop, and she called them forward one by one. The cook, the footmen, the laundry maids, the old gardener who had tended the rose beds for 30 years. She thanked each of them with a smile that did not reach her eyes, handed them an envelope, and pointed toward the door. It took less than an hour. When it was over, only one woman remained in the hall. She stood near the far wall, half in shadow, her hands folded in front of her apron. She had not moved during the entire proceeding. She had not trembled, had not wept, had not looked up even once. Cecilia studied her for a moment. Plain dress, quiet hands, eyes that seemed to look at the floor as though the floor were the safest place in the world. No threat there, Cecilia decided. "You," she said. "What is your name?" "Eleanor, my lady," the woman said softly. "You may stay, Eleanor." She said it the way one says nothing important. The way one decides which chair to sit in, or which glove to put on first. She did not know, on that bright autumn morning, that Eleanor had walked those corridors for 20 years. She did not know that Eleanor could find every room in Thornfield blindfolded, that she knew which floorboard creaked outside the library, which window latch stuck in cold weather, which drawer held the Duke's private correspondence and which held his grief. She did not know any of this. And Eleanor, for her part, said nothing. She simply picked up a cloth from the sideboard and began to iron, as she had done every morning for 2 decades, while the new Duchess of Ashworth turned and walked toward the staircase as though she already owned every stone of it. She did not yet know that she never had. The carriage had arrived 3 days earlier, on a Tuesday, which Cecilia had chosen deliberately. Tuesdays were unremarkable. Nothing grand ever happened on a Tuesday, which meant that whatever happened on this particular one would stand out all the more. She had read that in a book about strategy once, and she had never forgotten it. Cecilia Hargrove, Cecilia Ashworth now, she reminded herself, had always believed that timing was everything. She had married the Duke 6 weeks prior in a quiet London ceremony. Quiet because the Duke was 58 and unwell, and had no patience for spectacle. Quiet also because his family had not been informed until after the register was signed. That had been Cecilia's idea too. She was 29 years old. She was clever, and she had spent the first 29 years of her life in a house where cleverness was the only currency that ever spent. Her father had been a solicitor, respectable but not grand. Her mother had been beautiful, which had helped for a time, and then her mother had died, which had helped in a different way, leaving Cecilia with just enough inheritance to dress well enough to enter the rooms where the right people gathered. She had entered those rooms carefully, strategically, and with great patience. She had waited for the right man. The Duke of Ashworth had not been what she imagined when she was young. She had imagined someone tall and romantic, someone with fire behind his eyes. What she found instead was an aging man with kind hands and a deep sadness he never explained, who had looked at her across a dinner table in Mayfair one February evening and said, quite simply, "You are very sharp, Miss Hargrove. I find I am tired of people who are not." They had been engaged by April. Cecilia had not married for love. She knew this and felt no shame about it. Love was a luxury for women who had other options. She had married for Thornfield Manor, for the Ashworth name, for the kind of security that could not be taken away by bad luck or bad weather or a father's modest estate. She had married, in short, for everything that Eleanor had once had and lost. But she did not know that yet. Thornfield Manor was larger than she had expected, even from the descriptions. It sat at the end of a long gravel drive, surrounded by elms that were just beginning to turn gold at the edges. The stone was gray and old, the windows tall and mullioned, the front steps worn smooth in the center from 100 years of feet. It was the kind of house that did not need to announce itself. It simply existed, solidly and without apology, the way very old things do. Cecilia had stepped out of the carriage and looked up at it for a long moment. Then she had gone inside and begun making a list. The dismissals had been planned before she ever arrived. She had spent the carriage journey from London reviewing the household ledgers the Duke had given her, and she had made her decisions calmly, the way a general studies a map. Old staff meant old loyalties. Old loyalties meant whispers, comparisons, people who remembered how things used to be done, and said so with their eyes even when their mouths were closed. She wanted none of that. She wanted Thornfield to be hers, fully and without argument. And so, on that Tuesday morning, she had stood in the great hall and called them forward. 14 people. 1 envelope each. She had not expected to feel anything. She had not expected the old gardener to remove his hat and hold it against his chest as he left, the way men do in church. She had not expected the young kitchen maid to press her lips together so tightly they went white. She had not expected, in short, to feel the weight of what she was doing, not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it, some awareness that these were lives she was rearranging as easily as furniture. She pushed the feeling down. Sentiment was a luxury too. When it was over, there was only the woman by the wall. Eleanor. Plain, quiet, unreadable Eleanor, who had stood through the entire proceeding without flinching once, as though she had already known it would happen, as though she had already made her peace with it. Cecilia had studied her and seen nothing remarkable. She would spend a long time, later, thinking about that. In the days that followed the dismissals, Cecilia moved through Thornfield like a woman taking inventory. She opened cupboards. She examined the silverware. She sat in each of the main rooms and decided which furniture would stay and which would go. She wrote letters to London tradesmen, ordering new curtains for the drawing room, a different paper for the upstairs hallway. She was building something. She could feel it taking shape. Eleanor moved through those same days like a shadow that belonged to the house. She was always working. Cecilia never saw her idle, never saw her speak to anyone. There was, of course, no one left to speak to, never saw her pause or look out a window or do any of the small human things people do when they think they are unobserved. She simply worked. Dusting, pressing, polishing, carrying. Moving through the rooms of Thornfield with a quiet efficiency that might have been admirable, had it not been so unsettling. And she knew everything. That was what began to bother Cecilia. On the 3rd day, she asked Eleanor where the Duke kept his private correspondence. Eleanor walked to a small secretary desk in the study, opened the 3rd drawer on the left, and stepped back without a word. On the 4th day, Cecilia mentioned that her bedroom was cold at night. Eleanor, without being asked, adjusted something behind the wall panel near the fireplace, some mechanism of the old flue that Cecilia had not known existed, and the room was warm by evening. On the 5th day, Cecilia found her morning tea already prepared exactly as she liked it, though she was certain she had never told Eleanor how she took it. "How did you know?" she asked. Eleanor looked at the floor. "I pay attention, my lady." It was a perfectly reasonable answer. Cecilia could find nothing wrong with it. But that evening, a letter arrived from the Duke in London, written in his thin, careful hand. It covered 2 pages of estate business and medical updates and small observations about the weather. And then near the bottom, almost as an afterthought, be kind to Alina. Just that. 4 words. No explanation. Cecilia read the line 3 times. Then she folded the letter and set it on the desk and sat for a long while in the lamplight, looking at nothing in particular. Be kind to Alina. Not be kind to the staff. Not I hope you are settling in well, Alina. By name. As though the Duke knew from 50 miles away that she might need reminding. Cecilia was not a woman who frightened easily. But she was a woman who paid attention to details, and this detail sat in her chest like a small cold stone. She picked up her pen and wrote back. A pleasant letter, covering the same topics in the same order. Near the bottom she wrote, Alina is very capable. You need not worry. She did not ask why he had mentioned her. She told herself it was because she did not care. She knew, even as she thought it, that this was not entirely true. November came to Thornfield the way it always did, quietly, and all at once. One morning the elms along the drive were gold. The next they were bare. The sky settled into a flat, permanent gray, and the wind found every gap in the old stone walls, every loose window latch, every door that did not quite sit flush in its frame. The house breathed differently in November. Cecilia could feel it, a kind of exhale, as though Thornfield were letting go of something it had held all summer. She did not like it. She had grown up in a townhouse in Bath, where the cold was a manageable inconvenience and the walls did not groan at night. Thornfield's cold was something else entirely. It was the cold of old stone and older silences, of rooms that had held too many years of other people's lives. Some mornings Cecilia walked into the drawing room and felt, quite distinctly, that she had interrupted something. She told herself this was imagination. She was not a fanciful woman. She kept telling herself that. Alina, meanwhile, had begun preparing the house for winter with the same wordless efficiency she brought to everything. Extra wood was stacked by every fireplace. Heavy curtains Cecilia had never seen before appeared at the drafty windows. Old curtains, dark green velvet, slightly faded, clearly not new. When Cecilia asked where they had come from, Alina said simply, "The storage rooms, my lady. They have always been used for winter, always." She used that word often. This is where the candles are always kept. This is how the library fire is always laid. This is how it has always been done. Always, as though Alina's memory of the house stretched back further than any servant's reasonably should. Cecilia began timing her. Not deliberately at first. But she noticed, over the course of those gray November days, that Alina's knowledge of Thornfield was not the knowledge of a woman who had learned a house. It was the knowledge of a woman who had lived in one. There was a difference, Cecilia understood. Staff learned where things were kept. They memorized, they followed instruction, they adapted. But Alina did not behave like a woman working from memory. She behaved like a woman moving through her own home. She knew, for instance, that the small clock in the upstairs hallway ran 4 minutes fast. Not because she had checked it. Because she simply adjusted for it, the way one adjusts for a habit in someone one has known for years. She knew that the 3rd step on the back staircase was loose, and she avoided it without looking down. She knew, on a Thursday morning when the sky turned the particular shade of yellow-gray that precedes heavy rain, to go immediately to the east bedroom and place a towel beneath the window before the leak began. Cecilia had not known there was a leak. Alina had not been told to go. She simply went. "How did you know?" Cecilia asked, standing in the doorway of the east bedroom, watching Alina press the towel carefully into place. "It always leaks in that wind, my lady," Alina said. Has done for years. How many years? A pause, briefer than a breath. A long time, Eleanor said. She did not look up. Cecilia stood in the doorway a moment longer. Then she turned and walked away, because she could not think of what else to do. It was on a Friday afternoon, the second week of November, that Cecilia first heard about the first Duchess. She had accepted an invitation to take tea with Lady Morrow, who lived at the nearest neighboring estate, 2 miles across the fields. Lady Morrow was 70, sharp-tongued, and had known the Ashworth family for 40 years. Cecilia had gone because it was sensible to know one's neighbors, and because she was beginning to find the silences of Thornfield slightly too loud. Lady Morrow's drawing room was warm and overfurnished and smelled of dogs, which Cecilia found oddly comforting. They sat by the fire and talked for an hour about nothing of consequence: the weather, the state of the roads, mutual acquaintances in London, and Cecilia found herself relaxing for the first time in weeks. Then Lady Morrow had leaned forward and said, in the particular tone of a woman who has been waiting all afternoon to say a thing, "And how are you finding Thornfield? Really finding it, I mean. Not the answer you give at dinner parties." Cecilia had smiled carefully. "It is a remarkable house." "It is a sad house," Lady Morrow said, with the comfortable bluntness of great age. "It has been sad for 20 years. Perhaps you will change that." "I hope you will." She reached for a biscuit. "The Duke deserves some peace. He has not had much of it." "No," Cecilia agreed, though she was not entirely sure what she was agreeing to. Of course, the house was different before. When she was there, Lady Morrow said it the way one says something one assumes is already known. There was music then, I remember. She played beautifully. And flowers. She was always cutting something from the garden and putting it somewhere unexpected. You would open a door and find roses. Or lavender. Even in November, somehow. She shook her head with the small, genuine sadness of genuine memory. It has been very quiet since. Cecilia set down her teacup. "Since who?" she asked, keeping her voice light. Lady Morrow blinked. "Why, since the first Duchess, dear. Before your time, of course." "Long before," she waved a hand vaguely. "Dreadful business. The Duke never spoke of it, not to anyone. One simply stopped asking." "What happened to her?" Cecilia asked. Lady Morrow looked at her with the expression of a woman recalibrating. "She died," she said after a moment. "Quite young. It was very sudden." She paused. "At least that is what we were told." The fire crackled. Outside, the November wind moved through the empty trees. "At least that is what we were told." Cecilia heard the words with perfect clarity. She filed them away, behind her careful smile, and moved the conversation on to other things. But on the drive home, sitting alone in the carriage as Thornfield's chimneys rose gray against the gray sky, she turned the words over and over. The first Duchess. Dead young. Dreadful business. The Duke never spoke of it. At least that is what we were told. She arrived back at Thornfield as the last light was leaving the sky. Eleanor was in the entrance hall when she came in, trimming the lamps. She moved from one to the next with the unhurried ease of a woman who had done this 10,000 times, lifting each glass with the same careful hands, turning each wick with the same precise movement. Cecilia stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment. Lady Morrow's voice was still in her ears. There was music then. And flowers. She played beautifully. "Eleanor," she said. Eleanor looked up. "My lady, how long have you been at Thornfield?" Something crossed Eleanor's face. It was not quite an expression, more like the shadow of one, moving through and gone before Cecilia could name it. "I have been here a long time, my lady," she said. "That is what you always say." Cecilia kept her voice pleasant. "I am asking you to be more specific." Elinor lowered her eyes to the lamp in her hands. Her fingers did not stop moving. "Trim, adjust, replace the glass." "I came to Thornfield when I was young," she said at last. "I have not been away since." "And before Thornfield? Where did you come from?" "The north, my lady." A pause. "A small place." "No one would know it." Cecilia studied her. The plain dress. The quiet hands. The eyes that always found the floor. And for one strange, irrational moment, she thought about Lady Morrow's drawing room, and roses found behind unexpected doors, and music on winter afternoons. She pushed the thought away. It was absurd. Elinor was a servant, an unremarkable woman of no particular origin who trimmed lamps and ironed aprons, and said as little as possible. That was all. "Very well," Cecilia said, and walked toward the staircase. She did not see the way Elinor stood perfectly still after she had gone, the lamp forgotten in her hands, her eyes no longer on the floor but on the door at the far end of the hall, the door that was always locked at the end of the east corridor, the one with the old iron key that no one ever seemed to have. She stood there for a long moment, very still, the way people stand when they are trying not to feel something they are feeling anyway. Then she set the lamp down, picked up her cloth and went back to work. The locked door had bothered Cecilia from the beginning. It was not the only locked door in Thornfield. Old houses accumulated locks the way they accumulated everything else, slowly and without intention, until one day you noticed there were more than you remembered. But the others had explanations. The wine cellar, the gun room, the Duke's private study, for which she had eventually been given a key she had not yet used. This door was different. It sat at the far end of the east corridor, past the last bedroom, past the linen cupboard, at a point where the corridor narrowed slightly and the ceiling lowered by half a foot, as though the house itself had tried to discourage approach. The door was plain. Old oak, darker than the surrounding walls, with an iron handle that had gone slightly green with age. There was no nameplate, no indication of what lay beyond. Just the door and its lock, and the particular silence that seemed to pool around it. Cecilia had tried the handle on her second day at Thornfield. Locked. She had asked the housekeeper, before the dismissals, when there had still been a housekeeper, who had said only that the room had been closed for many years and that the Duke preferred it remain so. Cecilia had accepted this temporarily, the way one accepts an unpleasant fact while reserving the right to revisit it. She had not forgotten. In the 3rd week of November, she went looking for a key. She searched methodically, the way she did most things. The key cupboard in the kitchen. The drawers of the Duke's study. The small locked box on his writing table, for which she found a key taped to the underside of the center drawer, a hiding place so obvious it was almost charming. Inside the box, letters, a miniature portrait of a woman she did not recognize, and 3 keys, none of which fit the east corridor door. She tried the cellar. She tried the old butler's pantry. She spent an afternoon going through a trunk of miscellaneous ironware in the storage rooms, and came away with nothing but dusty hands and a headache. The key did not exist, or it did not want to be found. It was 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night when she found Elinor. Cecilia had not been able to sleep. This had become a pattern at Thornfield. She would lie in the large, canopied bed and listen to the house settle and breathe around her, and sleep would stay just out of reach. the way it does when the mind is working on something it has not yet finished. She had given up at 10:30, wrapped herself in a robe, and gone downstairs for something to read. She took the east corridor because it was the most direct route to the library. She saw Elena from the far end of the hall. She was standing in front of the locked door, not doing anything, not trying the handle, not pressing her ear to the wood, not examining the lock. Simply standing. Her back was to Cecilia, her hands at her sides, her head slightly bowed. She was still fully dressed, which was strange at that hour, and she stood so motionless that for one disorienting moment Cecilia thought she was looking at something that had always been there. A piece of the house. A thing that belonged. Cecilia stopped walking. She stood at the far end of the corridor and watched, and said nothing, because something about the quality of Elena's stillness made speech feel like an intrusion. It was the stillness of private grief, of the kind that people only allow themselves when they are certain they are alone. Elena did not turn. A minute passed. Perhaps two. Then Cecilia said quietly, "Elena." Elena turned. She was not crying. Her face was composed, the way it always was, that smooth, unreadable composure that Cecilia had stopped trying to interpret. But her eyes in the low lamplight were very bright. "My lady," she said, "I am sorry. I did not hear you. What are you doing here?" "I could not sleep," Elena said. "I often walk at night." It was a reasonable answer. Cecilia had a reasonable response ready. She opened her mouth to deliver it, and then did not. Instead she said, "Do you know what is in that room?" Something moved across Elena's face. That same almost expression, present and gone. "Yes," she said. Cecilia waited. "It was a child's room," Elena said after a moment. Her voice was even. "Careful. A nursery. It has not been used for a very long time." "Whose child?" The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. Cecilia counted them. "The Duke lost a child," Elena said. "Many years ago. An infant. He has kept the room closed since." Cecilia looked at the door. Then back at Elena. "Do you have a key?" she asked. Another pause. Then Elena reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a key. Old iron, small, slightly worn at the bow. She held it out to Cecilia without a word. Cecilia took it. She looked at it in her palm for a moment. Then she looked at Elena, who had lowered her eyes to the floor and was waiting with the patience of someone who has already decided to endure whatever comes next. "Come with me," Cecilia said. The room was small. That was the first thing, smaller than she had expected, given the size of everything else at Thornfield. It was a proper nursery, low-ceilinged and gently proportioned, with a single window that looked out over the east garden. There was a small fireplace, long cold, with a painted screen in front of it. A wooden rocking horse in the corner, white with a gray mane, one stirrup missing. A narrow bed with a carved headboard. A small table with 2 chairs, child-sized. Everything was covered in a fine, even layer of dust. Undisturbed. The dust of a room that had not been opened in a very long time. Cecilia moved through it slowly, holding her lamp. On the wall beside the window, there was a portrait. Small, oval-framed, hung at a height that suggested it had been placed to be seen by someone sitting in the low nursing chair beneath it. A young woman. Painted well, with careful attention to the eyes and mouth. She was perhaps 20, perhaps a little more, with dark hair simply dressed and an expression that was not quite a smile, more the look of someone who is content and knows it, and finds it slightly surprising. Cecilia studied the portrait for a long moment. Then she turned to look at Eleanor, who had stopped just inside the doorway and come no further. Eleanor was looking at the portrait. Not the way one looks at a painting. The way one looks at something that belongs to you. The lamp trembled slightly in Cecilia's hand. The woman in the portrait did not look like Eleanor. She was younger, softer, painted in the full light of someone who had not yet learned to make herself invisible. But something in the line of the jaw, something in the way the eyes were set. Eleanor, Cecilia said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Eleanor looked at her. Waited. Who is this woman? I don't know, my lady, Eleanor said. It was the first lie she had ever told her. Cecilia knew it instantly, the way one knows sometimes without being able to say how. She looked at the portrait. She looked at Eleanor. She looked back at the portrait. In the corner of the frame, nearly obscured by dust, there was a small engraved plate. Cecilia stepped closer and tilted the lamp. The engraving read, EMA. 1834. Initials. 3 of them. Cecilia stood very still. She thought about the locked box on the Duke's writing table. She thought about the letter inside. The miniature portrait of a woman she had not recognized. She had not looked at the miniature very closely. She had been looking for a key. But now she thought about the shape of the face, the set of the eyes. Be kind to Eleanor. The lamp threw long shadows across the nursery walls. The rocking horse stood in its corner. The small bed waited with its carved headboard and its thick, undisturbed dust. Cecilia did not say anything else. She turned and walked out of the room, and her feet carried her down the east corridor and down the stairs and into the Duke's study, where she opened the small locked box with the key from beneath the drawer and took out the miniature portrait and held it next to the lamp and looked at it for a very long time. Then she set it down on the desk. She sat in the Duke's chair. She sat there for a long time without moving, while the house breathed its old breath around her, while somewhere upstairs Eleanor stood in a child's cold room and looked at a portrait of herself as she had once been, 20 years ago, before she had learned to look at floors. At the bottom of the box, beneath the letters, there was a folded document. Cecilia picked it up. She unfolded it. Her eyes moved to the top of the page, where the formal script read clearly, in the careful hand of a church registrar, Certificate of Marriage. She read the names. She read them again. The lamp burned steadily. Outside, the November wind moved through the bare elms, making a sound like pages turning. Eleanor Margaret Harley and William Robert Ashworth, Duke of Ashworth. Married April 14, 1832. Cecilia did not sleep that night. She sat in the Duke's chair until the lamp burned low, and then she lit another and sat some more. The marriage certificate lay open on the desk in front of her. She had read it so many times the words had stopped looking like words and started looking like shapes, black ink on yellowed paper, formal and indifferent, recording a fact that someone had gone to considerable trouble to bury. Eleanor Margaret Harley and William Robert Ashworth, Duke of Ashworth. Married April 14, 1832. She was not a woman who panicked. She had never had the luxury. But she understood, sitting in that cold study in the small hours of the morning, that the ground beneath her had shifted in a way that could not be shifted back. Everything she had built in the past 6 weeks, the dismissals, the new curtains, the letters to London tradesmen, the careful architecture of her position as Duchess of Ashworth, all of it rested on a foundation that this single document made very uncertain. If Eleanor had married the Duke in 1832, and Eleanor was alive, then Eleanor was his wife. Which meant Cecilia was not. She pressed her fingers against her eyes and breathed slowly and thought. The law was not gentle on this point. She knew enough of her father's work to understand that a second marriage, contracted while a first spouse lived, was no marriage at all. It did not matter that she had not known. It did not matter that the Duke had presented himself as a widower, that the church register in London recorded him as such, that every document she had signed carried the Ashworth name in good faith. None of that mattered. The paper on the desk mattered. And Alina upstairs mattered. She thought about the Duke's letter. Be kind to Alina. Not a request. Something closer to an instruction. Something closer, now that she thought about it with new eyes, to an apology. He had known. Of course he had known. She went to Alina's room before dawn. It was a small room on the upper floor, near the back of the house. A servant's room, plain and low-ceilinged, with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out over the kitchen yard. The kind of room designed to be forgotten. Cecilia stood outside the door for a long moment. Then she knocked. There was a silence. Then the sound of movement. Then the door opened, and Alina stood there in a plain nightgown, a candle in her hand, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. Without the cap and the apron and the careful posture of service, she looked different. Older, perhaps. Or perhaps simply more herself. She looked at the marriage certificate in Cecilia's hand. She did not look surprised. You had better come in, Alina said. They sat on opposite sides of the narrow room, Cecilia on the single wooden chair, Alina on the edge of the bed, and Alina told her. She told it quietly, without drama, in the flat, careful tone of a person who has rehearsed a thing so many times inside their own head that the telling of it has been worn smooth. A story told to no one for 20 years, finally given air. She had been 20 when she married the Duke. He had been 38, not young but vital then, before the wars and the grief had taken their toll. She had been the daughter of a minor northern baronet, old family but reduced circumstances, and the match had not been considered ideal by the Ashworth family. His mother in particular had been opposed. Openly, vocally, without apology. But the Duke had been stubborn in those days. He had wanted Alina, and so he had married her in a small church in the north in the April of 1832, and brought her to Thornfield, and for a time, for a brief, bright time, the house had been full of music and flowers and the ordinary happiness of two people who suited each other well. Then his mother had come. She arrived in the autumn of that first year, with two of her sons and a solicitor, and she had laid the situation out with the precision of a woman who had been planning it for some time. Alina's family name was insufficient. Her connections were insufficient. Her dowry had been modest. She was not what an Ashworth duchess should be, and she never would be, and the Duke's mother had decided, practically and without malice, or so she told herself, to correct the situation. She did not ask him to divorce me, Alina said. Her voice was even. Her hands were folded in her lap. Divorce would have been public. It would have been a scandal. She was cleverer than that. What the Duke's mother had done instead was simpler, and far more difficult to undo. She had arranged for Alina to be declared dead. Cecilia stared at her. That is not possible. It is more possible than you might think, Alina said, when you have enough money and the right solicitor and a husband who is away in London and does not yet know what is being done in his name. A pause. There were papers. There was a doctor who signed them. There was a death recorded in a parish register that I have never seen but that apparently exists, somewhere, with my name in it. Alina Margaret Ashworth. Died November 1832. Fever, she said it without expression. the way one says a fact that has long since ceased to astonish. And the Duke? Cecilia asked. Something shifted in Alina's face. The first real movement she had seen there, a kind of tightening around the eyes. He was told I died, she said. He was away. By the time he came back, it was done. There was a grave I was shown at once. A stone with my name on it. She stopped. I do not know what he believed. I have never known. But you were here, Cecilia said. All this time. He must have. I was brought back to Thornfield 2 years later, Alina said. As a servant. His mother arranged that too. I think she believed, I know she believed, that proximity without recognition was its own kind of punishment. A pause. She was not wrong. The candle between them burned steadily. Outside the window, the first gray light of dawn was beginning to separate the sky from the fields. Why did you come back? Cecilia asked. Why did you not refuse? Why did you not go somewhere else, build a different life, tell someone what had been done to you? Alina looked at her for a long moment. Because of my son, she said. The silence that followed was very complete. Cecilia heard it as though from a distance. The small sounds of the house, the wind outside, the faint creak of the floorboard in the corridor that Alina had always avoided. All of it suddenly very distinct and very loud in the absence of words. You have a son, she said. I had a son, Alina said. He was born in the spring of 1833. He was 6 weeks old when they took him. She said it the way one says something that has been said so many times inside one's own mind that the words no longer have the power to break you open. Or perhaps they do still, and one has simply learned to hold the breaking very quietly. They told me he died. The same fever, they said. The same fever that had killed me. She looked at her hands. I did not believe them, she said. I have never believed them. A mother knows. She said this without sentiment, simply as a statement of fact. They told me he died, and I came back to Thornfield, because if he was alive, if there was any chance at all that he was alive, then being inside these walls was better than being anywhere else. Better than disappearing into the world where no one would ever think to look for him, where no one would ever think to look for me. Cecilia sat very still. And you stayed, she said. All these years. You stayed and ironed and carried wood and trimmed lamps and said nothing. For 20 years. Yes, Alina said. While the Duke, Cecilia stopped. Does he know you are here? Does he know who you are? Another pause. Longer than the others. I believe he suspects, Alina said carefully. I believe there are moments when he looks at me and something moves in his face. But he has never spoken of it. And I have never given him the opportunity. She paused. I was afraid that if I did, if I told him what I knew, what had been done, his family would act again. And if my son is out there and they have him, then, she did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Cecilia sat with this for a long time. She thought about the Duke's letter, and the miniature portrait in the locked box, and the marriage certificate with Alina's name on it, and the locked nursery with its dust and its rocking horse, and its small oval portrait hung at the height of a nursing chair. She thought about a man who had kept a nursery locked for 20 years, and a woman's portrait inside a private box, and written "Be kind to Alina" in a letter to a wife who did not know she was not his first. She thought about what it meant to carry a thing for 20 years and say nothing. And she thought with a clarity that surprised her about what she intended to do. She was not, in the end, a cruel woman. She had done cruel things, perhaps, the dismissals, the envelopes, the old gardener holding his hat against his chest. But cruelty had not been the point of those things, only an acceptable cost, and she understood now that the calculation had changed. Everything had changed. "I am going to London," she said. Elinor looked at her. "I am going to speak to the Duke," Cecilia said. "Directly. In person. Not by letter." She stood up from the wooden chair. "And you are going to tell me everything. Every name. Every detail. The solicitor, the doctor, the parish register. Every piece of it." Elinor studied her for a long moment. Her face was very still. "Why?" she said. Not suspicious. Genuinely asking. Cecilia looked around the small room. The narrow bed. The low ceiling. The single window onto the kitchen yard. "Because this is not a servant's room," she said. "And we both know it." She left for London 4 days later. She did not tell Elinor what she planned to say to the Duke. She was not entirely sure herself. She knew only that she had spent the 4 intervening days going through every document in the Duke's study with the systematic attention of her father's daughter, and she had found enough: a second certificate, an old letter from the Duke's mother in language that was careful but damning, a solicitor's bill from 1832 for services that were not specified but whose date and amount told their own story, to walk into a room and place the truth on a table and let it sit there. On the morning she left, Elinor came to the front steps to see her off. She stood with her hands folded, the way she always stood, and she watched Cecilia climb into the carriage. "If he denies it," Elinor said quietly, "if he says he does not know if he says." "He will not deny it," Cecilia said. She said it with the certainty of a woman who had read a man's private letters and looked at what he had kept in a locked box for 20 years and understood, finally, the precise shape of his guilt. Elinor looked at her. In the pale November light, with her hair pinned beneath her cap and her hands folded in front of her apron, she looked exactly what she appeared to be: a quiet, unremarkable woman who had learned to take up as little space as possible. And also, at the same time, something else entirely. "Be here when I come back," Cecilia said. Elinor nodded. Just once. The carriage moved down the drive between the bare elms, and Cecilia did not look back. She sat with her hands in her lap and her father's documents in a leather case beside her, and thought about what she was going to say to a duke who had kept a woman's portrait in a locked box for 20 years and called it grief. Behind her, Thornfield stood gray and still in the morning light. Inside it, Elinor went back to work. The Duke of Ashworth was dying. Cecilia had known he was unwell. She had known it since before the marriage. He had told her himself, with the blunt honesty of a man who had stopped seeing the point of pretense. His heart, the doctors said, weakening slowly, the way old things weaken, not all at once but in increments, each one small enough to ignore until suddenly they are not. He had perhaps a year, they had told him. Perhaps less. She had accepted this when she married him. She had calculated it. In fact, a short marriage to a duke was still a marriage to a duke, and widowhood carried its own advantages. She was not proud of this calculation. But she had made it, and she had been honest with herself about making it, which she considered marginally better than pretending otherwise. What she had not calculated was any of this. She found him in his London townhouse, in a first-floor sitting room that had been converted to a bedroom, so he would not have to manage the stairs. He was in a chair by the window when she was shown in, wrapped in a heavy blanket despite the fire, and he looked smaller than she remembered. 6 weeks at Thornfield had adjusted her sense of him. She had been thinking of him in the abstract, as a name on letters, a figure in the distance. Seeing him in person reminded her that he was a man, old and tired and running out of time. He looked up when she came in, and something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly. something more like recognition. As though he had been expecting her, if not today then soon. "Cecilia," he said, "you did not write ahead." "No," she said. "I did not." She sat down across from him and placed the leather case on the small table between them and opened it and took out the documents one by one and laid them in a row. The marriage certificate, the letter from his mother, the solicitor's bill, the second certificate, the one that recorded Aliner's death, with the doctor's signature at the bottom in a hand that had been paid well to be steady. She laid them out without speaking, and then she sat back and looked at him. The Duke looked at the documents for a long time. He did not touch them. "How did you find them?" he said at last. "You left them in a box," Cecilia said. "In your study. Under a false floor in the drawer, which is not as secure as you appear to have believed." He made a sound that might, in a different context, have been a laugh. "No," he said. "I suppose not." "I want to understand something," Cecilia said. She kept her voice level. She had practiced this on the carriage ride, not the words exactly, but the tone. Calm. Precise. The voice her father had used in difficult meetings. "I want to understand what you knew, and when you knew it, and what you chose to do about it." The Duke was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, London went about its business. Carriages, voices, the distant sound of a vendor calling something. The ordinary world, indifferent as always to private catastrophe. "I knew Aliner was alive," he said. "Not immediately." "My mother," he stopped, pressed his lips together. "My mother told me Aliner had died. I was in London. I came back to Thornfield, and there was a grave and my mother standing in front of it in her black dress, and he stopped again. I believed her. God help me, I believed her. She was my mother." "When did you stop believing her?" Cecilia asked. He looked at his hands. Old hands, she thought. Hands that had held a great deal and let go of more. "The second year," he said. "Aliner came back as a servant. My mother arranged it. She told me it was a girl from the north, a woman who needed the work. I did not see her immediately. I was not at Thornfield much in those years. I could not bear it." A pause. "When I finally came back and saw Aliner, standing in the hallway of my own house in a servant's dress and a cap, looking at the floor," he closed his eyes briefly. "I knew." "And yet you said nothing," Cecilia said. "I confronted my mother," he said. "She told me Aliner had agreed to the arrangement. That she had chosen it. That the alternative," he stopped. "She told me the child had died. That there was nothing to be done, and that speaking of it would only destroy what little remained." "You believe that too," Cecilia said. He looked at her. His eyes were very tired. "No," he said quietly. "I did not believe the child had died. But I could not prove otherwise, and my mother was a woman who did not make idle threats, and he paused. "I was not brave enough. That is the truth of it. I was not brave enough, and I told myself that Aliner was safe, that she was housed and fed and near the place she had loved, and I told myself this was enough, because the alternative was to admit what I had done and what I had failed to do, and I could not." He stopped. The fire crackled. Cecilia sat very still. "You kept her portrait," she said. "In a locked box. And her marriage certificate. And you kept the nursery closed, and wrote 'Be kind to Aliner' in a letter to your second wife, as though 4 words could account for 20 years. The Duke said nothing. "Did you know," Cecilia said carefully, "that your mother's solicitor kept records? That there is a letter, in your mother's hand, that describes the arrangement in considerable detail? That it names a family in Derbyshire, The Duke's head came up very slowly. "Derbyshire," he said. "A family named Calder," Cecilia said. "The bill from the solicitor references them. I believe, I cannot be certain, but I believe, that is where the child was placed." The Duke stared at her. Cecilia reached into the leather case and placed one more document on the table. Not an old one. A new one, a letter she had written herself, 3 days ago, before leaving Thornfield, and left with a courier in the village. "I have written to a solicitor of my own," she said. "I have asked him to make inquiries in Derbyshire about the Calder family, about whether they have a young man of approximately 22 years in their household, of unclear origin, perhaps adopted, perhaps fostered, perhaps told nothing at all about where he came from." The Duke was very still. "There is something else I need to tell you," Cecilia said. She said it quietly, and she said it plainly, and she watched his face as she said it. She told him that she was not legally his wife. She told him that she understood this, that she had understood it since the night she found the marriage certificate in the locked nursery, and that she did not intend to make it difficult. She told him that she wanted 2 things. The first was for him to acknowledge Eleanor, formally, legally, in front of whatever witnesses were required, as his wife and as Duchess of Ashworth. The second was for him to use whatever remained of his resources and his influence and his time to find the boy. She said all of this without raising her voice. When she finished, the Duke sat for a very long moment without speaking. Then he said, "Why are you doing this?" Cecilia considered the question. She had considered it herself, during the long carriage ride, during the 4 days of going through documents, during the night she had sat in a servant's room in the small hours of the morning, and listened to a woman tell a 20-year story in a flat, careful voice. "Because I went to Thornfield expecting to own it," she said at last. "And instead I found out what it cost." She paused. "I am my father's daughter. I know what documents mean, and I know what they can do, and I know that the only thing worse than having no power is having power and using it badly." She looked at him steadily. "I used it badly once, when I dismissed 14 people who had done nothing wrong. I do not intend to do it again." The Duke looked at her for a long time. Then he reached out and picked up the marriage certificate. Eleanor's marriage certificate. He held it carefully, the way one holds something old and fragile, something that has survived more than it should have had to. "She is at Thornfield," he said. It was not a question. "She has never left," Cecilia said. "He came to Thornfield on a Thursday, 12 days later." Cecilia had come ahead the previous week, and had said nothing to Eleanor except that the Duke was coming, and that she should not disappear. Eleanor had looked at her with those careful eyes and nodded and gone back to whatever she was doing, and Cecilia had watched her and thought that 20 years of waiting produced either despair or a very particular kind of patience, and that Eleanor had chosen patience, and that it had cost her enormously. The Duke's carriage came up the drive at 2:30 in the afternoon. Cecilia watched from the drawing-room window. She saw the carriage stop. She saw the footman open the door. She saw the Duke descend, slowly, leaning on the footman's arm, and stand at the bottom of the front steps and look up at the house. She did not go out. This was not her moment. She understood that clearly. She had sent Eleanor to the front hall. She never asked Eleanor what passed between them. It was not her business, and she understood that some things are too private to be witnessed, and too important to be summarized, and too long in the making to be compressed into a report. What she knew was that they were in the front hall for a long time, and that when she finally heard movement and went to the doorway, the Duke was sitting in a chair that had been brought from the drawing room, and Eleanor was standing near the window, and neither of them was crying, and the silence between them was not the silence of nothing but the silence of too much. The kind that fills a room so completely there is no space left for sound. The Duke looked up and saw Cecilia in the doorway. "Thank you," he said. His voice was very rough. Cecilia nodded. Then she went to the kitchen and made tea, because someone had to, and because she was not yet sure what else to do with herself, and because the kitchen was the one room in Thornfield where she had always felt, strangely, most at ease. The solicitor's letter arrived 3 weeks later. Cecilia was in the study when it came. She read it once, and then she read it again, and then she went to find Alina, who was in the garden cutting the last of the winter stems, because Alina had started cutting flowers again and putting them in unexpected places, and Cecilia had discovered that she did not mind this at all. "There is a letter," Cecilia said. Alina turned. She was wearing her plain dress and her cap, still, though Cecilia had suggested more than once that this was no longer necessary. Old habits. They took time. Alina looked at the letter in Cecilia's hand. "The Calder family," Cecilia said. "In Derbyshire. They have a young man. 22 years old. They took him in as an infant from a solicitor's office in London in the spring of 1833. She paused. "His name, the name they gave him, is Thomas. Thomas Calder. He works the family farm. He is by all accounts a good man." Another pause. "He has dark hair." The solicitor's letter mentions this. Dark hair and a particular way of. She paused, standing very still when he is thinking, which unnerves people who do not know him. Alina had stopped moving entirely. The winter garden was very quiet around them. The bare stems, the gray sky, the distant sound of rooks in the elm trees. "He does not know," Cecilia said gently. "The Calders told him nothing. But he is alive, Alina. He is alive and he is well, and he is 22 years old, and he does not know who he is yet." Alina looked at the letter. Then she looked at the garden. Then she looked at Cecilia. And for the first time, the very first time, in all the weeks and months since that autumn morning when a new duchess had pointed at her and said, "You may stay," Alina's composure broke. Not dramatically. Not with the clean collapse of theatrical grief. Just a sudden brightness in the eyes and a compression of the lips and a single exhale that carried 20 years inside it. And then her hands came up to cover her face, and she stood among the bare winter stems and she wept, quietly and without apology, while Cecilia stood beside her and said nothing and did not look away. The Duke signed the documents in December. His own solicitor was present, and Cecilia's solicitor, and 2 witnesses from the village. The paperwork was considerable, an acknowledgment of the first marriage, a formal recognition of Alina as his legal wife, a declaration that the second marriage had been contracted in error and was therefore void. There were documents Cecilia had to sign as well, and she signed them without hesitation, in her clearest hand, the way her father had taught her. Afterwards, the Duke asked to speak to her alone. They sat in the study by the fire, and he looked at her with his tired eyes and said, "You have given up a great deal." "I have given up a title I was never entitled to," Cecilia said. "That is not the same thing. Nevertheless, I would like to ensure that you are." "I am capable of ensuring my own situation," Cecilia said. "But I will accept a letter of reference, and perhaps the use of the bathhouse for 1 year, while I make other arrangements." The Duke looked at her steadily. "You could have destroyed her," he said. "You could have destroyed both of us. You had everything you needed." "Yes," Cecilia said. "I know." She did not explain further. She was not sure she could have, exactly. She was not sure there was a clean explanation for why a woman who had spent 29 years calculating her way through the world had chosen, in the end, to calculate differently. She knew only that she had sat in a servant's room in the dark and listened to a 20-year story and understood, somewhere beneath the calculation, what it meant to be a woman who had been unmade by other people's decisions. She did not want to be another person who made that decision for someone else. It was not heroism. It was something smaller and more honest than that. Thomas Calder came to Thornfield on a Tuesday in February. He arrived by public coach, which Cecilia thought was exactly right. He was tall, dark-haired, and stood on the front steps with his hat in his hands and looked up at the house with an expression she recognized. The expression of someone confronting something too large to take in all at once. Eleanor met him at the door. Cecilia watched from the drawing room window. She saw Eleanor open the door and step out onto the steps and stop. She saw the young man look at her. She saw neither of them move for a long moment. Then Eleanor reached out and took his face in both hands, the careful, capable hands that had ironed and polished and trimmed lamps for 20 years. And she looked at him, and he looked at her, and something passed between them that Cecilia could not see from a distance but could feel somehow, even through the glass. She turned away from the window. She sat down in the chair by the fire and picked up her book and did not read it, and listened to the old house breathe around her, and thought that Thornfield sounded different today. Fuller somehow. Less like an exhale. More like a beginning. 1 year later. March. Spring came early to Thornfield that year. The elms along the drive put out their first pale green before the end of February, and by March the garden was doing things that gardens do when someone is paying attention to them again. The rose beds that had gone woody and unpruned for years suddenly full of new growth. The kitchen garden replanted. The stone urns by the front steps overflowing with something yellow that nodded in the wind. Someone had found the old greenhouse at the back of the east garden, the one with the broken panes, and repaired it. There were seedlings inside it now, lined up in careful rows on the wooden shelves, each one in its small pot, each one tended. Eleanor had always had a way with growing things. Cecilia came back to Thornfield on a Thursday morning in March, in a hired carriage, unannounced. She was not sure entirely why she had come. She was settled in Bath, in a small but decent house in a good street, and her life there was taking shape in ways she had not anticipated and found, to her genuine surprise, that she preferred. She had taken a position assisting a firm of solicitors, unofficially, since officially such a thing was not done, but the senior partner had known her father and was old enough not to care what was and was not done. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. She was beginning to understand that this was not a consolation but an actual life. But she had thought about Thornfield in the evenings more than she had expected. She had thought about a locked door and a rocking horse, and a small oval portrait hung at the height of a nursing chair. She had thought about a woman standing in a corridor at 11 o'clock at night, not crying, just standing. The way people stand when they have run out of other options, and standing is the one thing left. She had thought sometimes about what the house looked like now. So she had come to see. The housekeeper who answered the door was new, a brisk woman from the village whom Eleanor had hired in the autumn, one of several new staff, properly engaged and properly paid. She showed Cecilia into the drawing room and went to announce her, and Cecilia stood in the middle of the room and looked around. It was the same room. The same proportions, the same tall windows, the same fireplace with its carved mantel. But the curtains were different, lighter, cream-colored, letting in more of the pale March sun. There were flowers on the side table, white and yellow, cut from the garden and arranged without fuss in a blue jug. A book lay open, face down on the chair nearest the fire. A piece of needlework on the ottoman, half finished. Small signs everywhere, of a room that was being lived in. Really lived in. Not managed. Not administered. Lived in. Cecilia stood and looked at it and felt something she could not quite name, not envy, not regret, something quieter than either. Something closer to the particular satisfaction of a thing correctly done. Alina came in 10 minutes later. She was dressed differently. Not elaborately. Alina would never be elaborate. It was not in her nature, but well. A dress that fit properly, in a deep blue that suited her, her dark hair simply but carefully arranged. She carried herself differently too, or perhaps she had always carried herself this way, and Cecilia was only now seeing it without the apron, and the cap, and 20 years of practiced invisibility layered over the top. She looked, Cecilia thought, like herself. Whatever that had always been. "You came," Alina said. There was no surprise in it. Only warmth, and something that might have been relief. "I was passing," Cecilia said. Alina looked at her. "I was not passing," Cecilia said. "I wanted to see how it looked." "And how does it look?" Cecilia glanced around the room. The flowers. The open book. The thin March sunlight on the cream curtains. "Different," she said. "Better." Alina smiled. It was a real smile, unguarded, without calculation, the smile of a woman who had remembered gradually over the course of a year how to let her face do what it wanted. It changed her entirely. It made her look, for a moment, like the young woman in the oval portrait. The one who had been content and known it, and found it slightly surprising. "Come," Alina said. "I will show you the house." They walked through Thornfield together, the two of them, unhurried in the pale morning light. The rooms were changed and not changed. The bones of the place were the same, the old stone, the tall ceilings, the floorboards that remembered every foot that had ever crossed them. But the atmosphere was different. The quality of the silence had shifted. It was no longer the silence of a held breath, but the silence of a house between its ordinary moments, the quiet between the music, not the absence of it. They came, eventually, to the east corridor. Cecilia stopped at the far end and looked toward the door. It was open. Not wide open, simply ajar, the way a door stands when it has been used recently and left on the latch. A stripe of light fell through from the window inside, pale and clean, crossing the corridor floor. "Thomas repainted it," Alina said beside her. "The whole room." He asked what color, and I said yellow, because I had always meant to, and never. She paused. "We put the rocking horse in the nursery that the new housemaid's children use when she brings them. Someone should ride it." Cecilia looked at the stripe of light on the corridor floor. "And the portrait?" she asked. "Still there," Alina said. "I thought about taking it down. I decided to leave it. It is a good painting, and she is not an embarrassing person to have been. A beat. I was happy when it was painted. I think it is useful to remember that." Cecilia nodded slowly. They stood for a moment in the corridor, looking at the open door and the light that came through it, and said nothing, and did not need to. Thomas was in the library when they found him. He was sitting at the large table with papers spread out in front of him, working through what appeared to be estate accounts with an expression of concentrated focus that was so entirely Alina's that Cecilia almost laughed. He looked up when they came in, and stood, and greeted Cecilia with the careful courtesy of a young man who had been raised decently, and was still learning what he was in addition to that. He was learning quickly. She could see it in him, the gradual settling into something, the way a person settles when they have found the shape of where they belong. He had been at Thornfield for 4 months, and he still had the watchfulness of someone newly arrived. But underneath it, there was something steadier already taking root. He had a leaner stillness, and, she suspected, the Duke's stubbornness, and a quality that belonged entirely to himself. A kind of uncomplicated directness, the directness of a man who had grown up working with his hands and saw no reason to be indirect about anything. The Duke had met him in January. Cecilia had heard about this from Aliner's letter. Brief, factual. Aliner's letters were always brief and factual, which had said only that it had gone better than expected, and that the Duke had cried, and that Thomas had not known what to do about this and had made tea, which Aliner considered a reasonable response. The Duke had died in February, peacefully in his London house, with Aliner beside him. She had gone to him when the message came, and she had stayed until the end, and she had come back to Thornfield afterwards and cut flowers from the greenhouse and put them in every room, which was how Cecilia knew, reading between the lines of the letter, that Aliner was grieving in the only way she knew how. He had not been a good husband. He had not been a good man, entirely, in the ways that had mattered most. But he had been sorry, and he had been brave at the end, which Aliner had decided was worth something. Cecilia thought she was probably right. Thomas had inherited the title. The paperwork had been considerable, the lawyers had been expensive, and there had been 2 members of the Duke's extended family who had objected strenuously until shown the documents, at which point they had objected slightly less strenuously and then gone quiet. Thomas was now, legally and entirely, the Duke of Ashworth. He did not yet know what to do with this. He was working on it. Cecilia had lunch with them in the dining room, at the long table that had always seemed too large for the house and now, with 3 people at one end of it, seemed merely generous. There was good food and easy conversation, and more laughter than Cecilia had expected, most of it generated by Thomas, who had a dry, unhurried wit that ambushed you when you were not looking for it. She thought, watching Aliner watch her son across the table, that there were very few things in the world that looked exactly like what they were. Happiness was one of them. It was unmistakable. It did not require explanation or description. It sat at a dining table in an old house in the March sunshine, and it laughed at something a 22-year-old said about the estate accounts, and it was entirely, completely, and without qualification itself. Cecilia ate her lunch and was glad she had come. Afterwards, Aliner walked her to the front door. They stood on the steps in the pale afternoon light, and Cecilia looked down the long gravel drive between the elms, which were just beginning to think about being green, and she thought about a Tuesday in autumn and a carriage coming up this same drive, and a woman in new silk gloves deciding, in the time it takes to look at another person and see nothing worth worrying about, to let her stay. "I have been thinking," Aliner said, "about what I might have done differently." Cecilia looked at her. "I have decided," Aliner said, "that I might have opened the door sooner." "Any of the doors?" A pause. "I was always waiting for permission. I was always waiting for someone to tell me it was allowed." She looked out at the drive. "It was a very long wait." "Yes," Cecilia said. "I imagine it was." Aliner turned to look at her. "And you? Are you well?" "In Bath." "I am surprisingly well," Cecilia said. "I am doing work I am good at. I am living in a house, the right size for one person. I have a cat which I did not plan but which appears to have planned me." She paused. "I am not a duchess. It turns out this is acceptable." Aliner looked at her for a moment with those steady eyes. Then she reached out and took Cecilia's hand briefly, just for a moment, just a press of the fingers, and let it go. "Come back in summer," she said. "The roses will be extraordinary." I have been making up for lost time. Cecilia looked at the rose beds along the front of the house, newly pruned, already showing the first swelling of new growth along the canes. I will, she said. She meant it. She was halfway down the drive when she heard the front door of Thornfield close behind her, and she turned once to look back. The house stood in the afternoon light, gray stone and tall windows, and the yellow nodding things in the stone urns. The door was shut. Smoke rose from two of the chimneys in thin, peaceful columns. From the library window, she could just make out the shape of Thomas at the table, bent over his papers again. And in the east wing, on the upper floor, the window of the room that had been locked for 20 years stood open. Just open, letting in the March air, letting in the light. Cecilia looked at it for a moment. Then she turned back to the drive, and the waiting carriage and the road to Bath and walked on. She had been the wrong Duchess in the right place at exactly the right time. She had spent 29 years learning to take what she needed from the world. It had taken Thornfield to teach her what she actually wanted. It turned out they were not the same thing at all. And that, she thought, as the carriage moved away between the greening elms, was not a defeat. It was the beginning of something she did not yet have a name for. She decided she had time to find one. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.